KCYBLP 103.5 FM is Cypress Radio. Cypress.
From Cypress Radio in Cypress, Texas, you've tuned into the Special Ed Section 504 Radio Hour, and I'm your host, Louis Geigerman. Welcome back. Well, baseball is still on our minds here, at least it's on my mind. Actually, football season's opening this weekend. The Houston Astros are up 3 games over the Texas Rangers and 5.5 over the Los Angeles Angels. So Astros are still in first place. I'm an Astros fan. Go Astros. Again, I want to thank everybody for their calls, letters into the television station here in Houston at KUHT for helping it make possible for the Dream Team, the Dream League, to be able to be televised here locally as part of the Little League World Series. It was a tremendous interview last week with my friend Jim Goldman. It's just been a really exciting time. You know, I haven't had a real opportunity to do this, but from the outset, I want to once again thank Rick Calvert for making this possible, the general manager here with Cypress Radio, to make this program a reality. And so, Rick, it's a hat off to you. It's fun, and I think we're making a real difference in what we do. Well, we have an exciting show today. Today, I'm going to bring on my good buddy David Beinke, and David's kind of an interesting fellow. He's a senior special education advocate and helps provide a unique brand of support for children with special needs in their educational environment to families throughout the state of Texas. Reading this from his website, actually. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in education, is also a former U.S. Marine. In fact, he claims the moniker, the Special Ed Marine. David has over 20 years of experience in the Texas mental health and mental retardation community center system, both as a supervisor and a provider of case management services. He also works with social worker Robin Petty to facilitate representation to persons in receiving their disability benefits, and is very skillful, that's through the Social Security Administration, and is very skillful in advocating for persons in employment, labor union, and workman's comp cases. David is a talented musician, frequenting various musical venues in the Central Texas area as a drummer. In fact, he was the drummer and a founding member of a group entitled the Redneck Jedi. He has many skills that do not end here, as David also provides private chess lessons as an avid player. David is a longtime COPA member. That's the organization I've told you all about before, that I encourage everybody on the show to become a member. It's called the Council of Parents, Attorneys, and Advocates. It's the leading parent advocate, parent organization for kids with special needs in the country. It's the largest of its kind, and it's really an incredible organization that I'm a founding member of. And David is on the COPA Advocate Committee and is a sitting member of its board of directors. As many of you already know, David has a gift of gab. You're going to find that out here in a few minutes. So there will be a few eyes that will be rolling at some of his jokes, maybe a few with mine as well. And he has artfully mastered the pun. All of us here at those at Cirkiel and Associates, who he's employed with, Cirkiel and Associates in Round Rock, Texas, thinks he's very punny as opposed to funny. And he often says, under IDEA, a parent should never be caught between a Round Rock, that's where his office is, and an ARD place, ARD place. That's what we call IEP meetings here in Texas. Well, David, I had you on for a few minutes a couple of weeks ago, but, this is going to be more formal. We're going to spend a lot more time together. I want to welcome you to the the Special Ed Section 504 Radio Hour.
Thank you, Lou. It is a pleasure. Humbly honored to be on this wonderful day, even though I am a Texas Ranger fan, and the Houston Astros are certainly playing beyond their ability, as many Houston players do, but we'll save that for another day.
Ouch. Well, they got 7 games to play with each other, so we'll see how that fleshes out over the next month. We're in the dog days of September. We hope they kick your rear ends real good. How about that?
Well, that being said, we'll proceed to the more neutral, interesting ground, the 504 in the special ed.
Absolutely. All right, David, you are the developer, I should say, the founder of, of the Advocates Toolbox. And let's kind of talk about what the Toolbox is, and let's talk about the different parts of the Toolbox.
Sure. A little history. A lot of times, parents just want to know what to do. And like a mechanic, you're looking for the correct tool. This is the wrench, the hammer, the saw, screwdriver. What do you need? And this really came to a real concentrated effort when Hurricane Katrina hit. When Hurricane Katrina hit, we had thousands and thousands of students hitting in the direction of Texas, Houston, Austin, Beaumont. Oh, my goodness, it was unbelievable. And trying to process the number and sheer volume we encountered was very, very difficult, because prior to Katrina, we would go through our usual standard, here's how IDA works, and I had one gentleman from New Orleans who said, David, you're talking too much. Just tell me what to do. And a light went off. And so rather than go into the 14 ways to have an ARD, we developed a toolbox. In other words, here are some things you can do, easy to understand. You don't need to fully comprehend all the software. But if your child is struggling, here's what you do. You just do 1, 2, 3. It's like following a recipe. It's like driving a car. You don't have to understand the mechanics or theory of how internal combustion works. You just need to know drive, reverse, brake, gas, left, right, back up, and where to go. And so with that, the toolbox was born. Because when you look at it, the options a parent has, it really kind of falls into 3 domains. Certainly we have procedural safeguards, et cetera, but to really think of it, you think of it like a business. If you think of it like a business, and I'll use a bank as a good example, if a bank loses your money, you'll go through 3 places. You'll try local first, bank president, bank officer. If that doesn't work, you go to the state bank insurance commission, or you can go to the FDIC, local, state, or feds. Well, the same is true with schools, and they are a business. They are the business of education. Sometimes we lose sight of that fact, and parents at the bottom of the totem pole rather than the top of the totem pole. So if you really think about the purpose of the schools, they really are a business of education. They take taxpayer money, parent money, and their sole mission is to educate your child. And if your child has a disability, their sole mission is to educate your child. It doesn't change. That is their sole mission, and somehow that gets lost in the translation with all the complexities, psychobabble, and educationalese that we have. So going back to the toolbox is finding some tried and true, call them business intervention on the educational side. That's how it's developed at the local, state, or federal level. And because that's where you're going to go. And a lot of times, the parent doesn't have to use that. But once the school knows that you have options at the local, state, or federal level, all of a sudden you have leverage in the conversation. You have arrows in your quiver, so to speak, just like the bank. If the bank president knows you're going to go to the state banking commission or the FDIC, you may have a different conversation if they just think you're stuck. Because a lot of parents think they can go to an ARD and that's it. Well, an ARD is one of many, many options. I think there's 75 actual tools in the toolbox, but we'll cover kind of the basic 10 or 15 today.
All right.
And
so
let me give you some examples.
Very good. Give me some examples.
Sure.
Great.
So let's take examples. Now, when you're going local, state, or feds, there's advantages and disadvantages of each. Take the federal level example. Feds are powerful. Just like if you get a letter from the IRS, you don't know it's a refund or an audit, but it says IRS. You're going to pay attention to that letter. The same is true. One of the most commonly used interventions is an OCR complaint. OCR is the Office of Civil Rights with the Federal Department of Education. The Office of Civil Rights with the Federal Department of Education. In fact, if you Google in OCR complaint, guess what pops up? An OCR complaint. It's a 24/7 online complaint. What is a complaint? Well, just like in a business. What is a complaint? Name and address. What went wrong? What do you want? That's
David,
what a complaint is.
David, hold on for a second.
Yes.
Okay. When somebody does Google an OCR complaint, it doesn't necessarily come up to U.S. Department of Education because there's also OCR complaints with the Health and Human Services. So you want to be clear that it's an OCR through the U.S. Department of Education. Go ahead.
Excellent point, Lou. Is there are other OCRs. United States Department of Agriculture has an OCR department. The United States Health and Human Services has OCR complaint process, and so does the Department of Education. So you want to make sure you are, Lou is absolutely correct, good point, Lou, is that you are with the United States Department of Education, and it's 24/7. Now, even though, and if they know that you know how to file a federal complaint, sometimes you don't have to do that. You just have to let them know you're about to do that. In fact, a lot of times techniques, just like in a business, if you're dealing with, Walmart or McDonald's, you can let them know you're a dissatisfied customer. They have not provided the service. In this case, they've not provided the service or the depth of service needed to take care of your child. So you're going to have that conversation. It's more than just having an argument. Say, look, we haven't worked it out. We're heading to a federal complaint. And usually, whether or not you win the complaint or not, it's hard to tell. But anybody who's ever been through a federal investigation, you ever been through a tax audit, you ever been through a OSHA inspection, if you ever go through any kind of federal investigation, it ruins your day. And most folks, including superintendents, board members, they don't like to get letters say, hi, I'm from the feds, I'm about to investigate. And so that's a very common level. Now, the bad part is, there is a downside, the feds have never been known for moving very fast. In fact, it may take 3 to 6 months to get your complaint investigated. And that time, what happens to the child? So a lot of times, it's not just filing the complaint, it's just mentioning that you have knowledge that you could file the complaint. Let's use the state level as an example. In your procedural safeguards, there's 3 very, very common procedural safeguards of a complaint, due process, and mediation. Well, what's the complaint at the state level? No different than the federal level. This is TEA, Texas Education Agency, and you can Google that up. It does work specifically, TEA Special Ed Complaint. Just Google search term, TEA Special Ed Complaint. And that's TEA, the Texas Education Agency, and they have a complaint form. And again, it's just name and address, what went wrong, what do you want? That's a standard template you can use for almost everything under IDA or 504. Now, they're a little faster at the state level. When you file a complaint, it takes 60 days. At the end of 60 days, so if you file on September 1st, by October 30th, you'll have an administrative finding of whether your complaint is sustained and whether remedies are granted. Because remember, you always want, it's just not enough to complain. Because when I hear a parent tell me, well, I told the principal 3 times. I told the psychologist 4 times. I told the superintendent 5 times. I went to his office. Verbal doesn't count. Verbal doesn't count. One more time, verbal does not count. And so it's almost like the Henny Youngman joke. They go something like, I went to the doctor. I said, doctor, I broke my arm in 7 places. And the doctor said, don't go to those places. So again, verbal doesn't count. It's almost like the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. So if you have an art, have 1 art, maybe 2 if you're nice. But after that, try something else. Try one of the complaints. Moving back to the state level, there's 2 other options. One is mediation. We love mediation. It's a high percentage rate, about 80% according to TA stats. And your part, and the parent is part of the decision-making process. And that's what's really wonderful about mediation. And also remember, you can use these complaints in combinations. In fact, we find if you use different combinations of state level or local interventions, you'll have a high result. Using the Marine Corps amphibious warfare strategy, you can attack an enemy position one way. You may or may not get through. But if you attack at any position 3 or 4 ways, some get through. School's no different. Remember, it's a business. The other part is a due process. Due process is an administrative hearing. Think of it as special ed judge duty. That's what it looks like. If you think you can do special ed judge duty, or you can do judge duty, you can do special ed judge duty. It's a form. The wonderful thing, these cost nothing. These cost nothing. They are free. And that's why all these things are embedded, because the way the system is set up is the school is, when Congress designed this critter called IDA, it was assumed the school would have knowledge of process, vocabulary, and all the dynamics that go with it. So to protect the parent, they have this complex set of procedural safeguards, some of which we're mentioning, and sometimes just called the toolbox. When you say it's a procedural safeguard, you got 18 pages of X, Y, Z, sometimes hard to understand. But if you know there's a form, all you have to do is put your name and address, what went wrong, what do you want, there you go. Everybody can do that. Every parent can do that. So we have the three options. Mediation, again, it's just a request to TA. There's a form, name and address, what you like to have, and what you want to mediate. Again, there's a sequence to all that. Same way with due process. What do you want to go to hearing for? Name and address. What do you want to go to hearing for? And what do you want? More OT, more speech, private placement. Now, it's not always easy to do that, but the initial side is, because all it is submitting the complaint. And usually, once a complaint hits, or they think you're going to file a complaint, you're going to have a much more robust conversation with your school district.
Let me go one step here. That's a good overview. Okay. I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, and I want you to continue. But one other arrow in your quiver that you could use is a OSEP letter of clarification regarding policy guidance. You want to talk about that too? Sure.
Let me finish let me thank you for putting a caboose on my train of thought.
Sure.
And so there are other levels, and I'll loop back to that, because OSEP is one of them, and we'll hit probably 10 or 15 little toolbox things beyond. I want to make sure the main workhorses of the toolbox are there, and they are indeed your procedural safeguards. Moving to the local level for just a second, there's a level 1, 2, 3 complaint. Every school district in Texas, and most states outside of Texas, have some kind of internal administrative chain of command. It's a complaint. In Texas, it's called level 1, 2, 3. Level 1 is equal to principal. Level 2 is equal to superintendent. Level 3 is equal to school board. Most teachers and principals, if they know you're about to go to the school board, that's not good for their career. It's not good for their future vocation. So a lot of times things get snuffed out in terms of resolution because they don't want you going to the school board. Because remember, who's on the school board? Those are your fellow citizens. And they're concerned about what goes on because they don't hear what goes on in an art or what goes on in a life skills classroom. They don't hear the budget battles of special ed because school board usually gets lots of good information, but it's not about the trials and tribulations of the school board. And I'll give a couple of examples real quick. We had a level 3 in front of the Cypress Fair school board a few years back, and the school board is actually outraged at what happened to the parent. They asked the school to go to mediation where it resolved. Lou, as an example, in a case in Humble ISD, or Humble ISD if you're not from there, is assisted a parent filing a level 3 school board complaint while the school board was in session. A few weeks later, a few days later, it settled. And so remember, using the toolbox, using your options in multiple ways, not just one way, in multiple ways is always a good thing to do. Going back to what Lou had mentioned, there's a wonderful kind of OSEP letter clarification. OSEP is part of the Federal Department of Education, and OSEP is the Office of Special Ed Populations, and they offer guidance, clarification, and facilitation of understanding for rules, laws, things of that nature. And I'm going to turn to Lou for one moment because Lou was noted for submitting a wonderful OSEP letter clarification on a question of OT. And I want to take you through just the dynamics because it's really simple. It's a letter. asking, what does this mean? Lou, let's do your letter on OT real quick.
Sure. A related service person in occupational therapy had made the remark in an IEP meeting that we were asking for assistance or more assistance in occupational therapy, and the occupational therapist for the school district said, "Oh, well, that's a medical. What you're looking for is the medical needs of the child, not the educational needs." And and because of that, we don't need to do that. So, I said, okay, I've never seen anything directly related to it. There is some discussion about medical needs in IDEA, but I wanted to have a clarification about medical versus, clinical, which is what she meant, medical, clinical, versus educational needs. So I sent a letter to OSEP asking a clarification on that, and how does that impact an individual's, how does that impact an individual to get services? And OSEP responded with a letter over time explaining that really there is no definition per se, because, if you look at the definition of related service, it's about remediating a problem. And, this was an issue of function for the student, to increase their function, which I believed impacted the child educationally. So OSEP came back with a letter of guidance. They're very, very, even OSEP letters there's been some weight that have been given by hearing officers and have actually cited them in decisions, because this is policy. While it's not a decision from a court, it's still policy guidance from the department that oversees special education. So they're given a lot of weight by a lot of hearing officers. And what effectively the letter to Geigerman said, and that's in the Federal Register, you can look it up, effectively said what it means is that any related service that helps a child to benefit from special education is something that a school district needs to do. So it's funny, anytime a related service individual started going into a lecture to me about what OT is supposed to be or any other related service, I said, "Oh, really? I'm actually kind of familiar with it. Maybe you might want to read my letter to Geigerman, the Federal Register. Do you have a letter? A letter in the Federal Register about what you're saying?" And that usually gets them to shut up, and then we move on from there. But an OSEP letter can be very, very effective in changing the conversation about what something is, what policy really should be, and how special education service or procedure is supposed to be followed. Okay. You there, Dave?
And what's really nice, that particular OSEP letter was called Letter to Geigerman. So if it comes back to you, you actually have you are memorialized forever in the United States Department of Education with your name. So we have Letter to G-Man. Now remember, a toolbox, just like in a business, there are those official things such as OCR complaints, TA complaints, mediations, OSEP letters, level 1, 2, 3s, et cetera. But there's also the informal. And so by informal, I mean, what would you do in a business? What would you do if it was affecting some aspect of your life that wasn't in education? Well, let's talk about some of the more creative options, because we hit on some of the procedural safeguards. There's also IEEs. There's regional service centers. All those are good. And they're wonderful if they work. However, sometimes using non-traditional creative options, sometimes, and again, these don't cost a thing, because the idea is, why should it cost you, the parent, anything to advocate for your child's education? Now, don't get me wrong. Lou and I will always be happy to get paid for what we love to do, and that's advocate for your child. But part of what we do is not to just throw you fish, but it's to teach you fish, because everything we do is actually designed for parents to do and know. So that's part of the conversation. So let's talk about a couple creative things at the local, state, federal. And let's start with the local, because there are more options locally, because it's your community. You have friends. You have networks. You have businesses. You live in that community for a period of time. So one of the ways to help kind of shift the dynamics is, who do you take to an ARD or an IEP meeting if you're out of state? And so, because usually it's the parent or a parent and their partner, or maybe a parent and their advocate. And the school brings 5, 10, sometimes 20 people to the ARD. It's real intimidating, really, really difficult for the parents. So remember, you can bring folks too. A couple examples. You can bring your next door neighbor. You can bring 2 your next door neighbors, or you can bring the president of the campus PTA. Because when you start bringing regular ed moms or somebody who is part of the campus organizational bodies, such as the head of the volunteers, head of the PTA, they start looking how you're treated. Because all of a sudden it shifts the dynamics. They're not going through a cookie-cutter software adverse kind of sequence with the parent. They're now looking at someone who doesn't see it routinely. It'll change the dynamics. What about grandma and grandpa? Sometimes we call it the respective elders. When you bring someone who has a lot of life experience, like your great aunt, your great uncle, your grandpa, your grandmothers, because they've been around for a long time, very rarely is there any disrespect, because that's what you have, is you have somebody who's 60, 70, maybe even 80 years old. And when they come to the ARD, or IEP meeting, if you're outside of Texas, it gives a certain gravitas, it gives a certain statesman-like quality, because here are some individuals who have seen life. They understand life. They're usually wise decision makers. Down in the valley, which is along the Texas-Mexico border, we love that. Make it look like a quinceañera. You bring aunts and uncles, because sometimes we outnumber them, and it really balances the conversation. Also, we should remember,
you might also bring in clergy, members of the clergy.
Just getting there is that sometimes we call it holy water. And so if you have a rabbi, a priest, Baptist minister, whatever faith you have, and I use the one down in a small Texas Valley town, they had Father Joe. It was a predominantly Catholic town. We added Father Joe to the mix. Well, Father Joe in the Catholic Church hears everybody's confession. And it was one of the best arts he had. Yes, Father Joe. Yes, more OT, Father Joe. Yes, Father Joe. And so just having that, again, outside presence of a faith-based individual, member of your church, member of a community service organization, member of the Kiwanis, member of a city council, member of your fraternity, grandma and grandpa, just bringing individuals outside of the regular art process helps balance that out. The other piece that we also find helpful, if you have somebody who's in 5th grade and above, how come the child is not at the yard? Because when you start using the child to the extent they can, and 5th grade, certainly middle school and high school, when they are there, all of a sudden shifts dynamics. It's not parents talking to school personnel or school personnel talking to parents. It's the child. Why are we there? About the child. As originally stated, what's the purpose of the school? To educate your child on your money. Because that's when you reduce it to that basic factor, it gives you a tremendous amount of leverage in the conversation to remind the principal or the LSSP, the special director, why are they there? Okay? Remember, you're not there to serve them, because sometimes it looks at that our committees or IEP meetings are where the parents is a required nuisance.
David,
no, not really.
David, let me jump in on that. I have found some of the best ARD meetings that I have had over the years have been when I've had kids in there, and that kids can actually articulate and share the concerns that they have, and that are empowered to say, and a lot of times this happens more when I have kids that have learning disabilities, but those that are able to articulate their concerns, the ears are really perked up with members of the yard committee, and that puts them on a special, a special alert. They pay special attention to what the student is saying over about anybody else in the meeting. So if you have a kid that is able to articulate their concerns, that is extremely powerful and extremely effective.
Absolutely. I can't reemphasize that point enough. And even if the child can't be there, their input is tremendous. Because remember, sometimes with our children these days, give them a pencil and paper, boy, they're lost for words. Give them an iPhone, give them a Facebook, give them some of the social media, they're all over it. So remember, you can also provide input in the communication grid they're comfortable with. Because if they text all the time, have them text you. Have them text the special ed director. Have them tweet 140 words or less. Real simple. I'm not getting my pragmatic speech. I'm not getting my social skills. I can't make friends. I need help. And so it doesn't have to be anything complex. It doesn't have to have the technical language. It's the student communicating his needs. Because that's really, again, we think what ID is all about, is how do we serve that child based on his individual unique needs. So that child, even if they're nonverbal, they can communicate. They will tell you something about how they feel about school, about how they feel about a particular service or a particular classroom or even a particular teacher. So that's really, we can't emphasize enough to keep it as student-centric as possible because it really, really changes those particular dynamics. A couple other little things that you can mention. Remember, sometimes one of the corollaries, not trying to be funny here, but the success of an IEP meeting is directly proportional to the amount of caffeine, sugar, and artificial coloring available to its participants. So a lot of times, sometimes one of our toolboxes is how to kind of breakfast, tacos, Starbucks, and donuts your way to consensus. If you bring things, bring food. Buy a pizza for the teachers. Bring them coffee. Bring them cold drinks. And even though you may be crossways, you may just be at severe odds with the district, you've shown your gratitude and generosity by bringing them something. Because if you think about a teacher nowadays, with all the STAR testing or the state-mandated testing, number of hours they work, the amount of information they're supposed to have about every disability under IDA, the amount of administrative oversight that occurs when something goes wrong, the amount of work that goes up when advocates like me and Lou show up, their workload just got a lot. It's just showing appreciation for what they do. Or even leaving something in the teacher's lounge. You leave a bowl of fruit in the teacher's lounge, they're going to say, well, who did that come from? Because the teacher's lounge, that's where they all talk about parents, about students. So anything you can do to buy some goodwill. Another little piece of this, sometimes we always suggest the special ed director is your BFF. Not in a funny way, but if you don't know who the special ed director is, or they don't know who you are, maybe it's a good thing to do. Because why? Think about it like a business. Anyone that has the budget, the decision-making power and authority to make a decision on behalf of your child, don't you want to go know them? It's like Walmart. Maybe they get it right or don't get it right at the local customer service or local department store. But if you go to the Walmart regional manager or the statewide manager, or you even call Bentonville and have the ghost of Sam Walton chase him around, it really, really has an impact. So when you're beyond just an ARD and you're in some kind of disagreement or difference, whoever you're talking to, they need to have the budget, position, authority to grant your wish. Guess what a special ed director has? They have money. And they can spend that money on your child. And just having a good relationship, to the extent you can, maybe you're crossways, maybe you're not, but sometimes that special ed director who knows you as a person, not being reported through a chain of command as being an irritable parent, it has a huge way of having impact. Also, there's other groups out there that sometimes are a little different, but they have an impact nonetheless. There's a group up in Illinois, and they're called the Mothers from Hell. Mothers from Hell. And they took that label because that's what administrative folks referred them to, because they were kind of over the top in their face about their child's special education needs. Well, some of the parents here in Texas started wearing their T-shirts, bringing their coffee mugs, Mothers from Hell. One of my favorite arts of all time is when the parents, the aunts and uncles, dressed up with their Mothers from Hell T-shirts, brought their coffee mugs. Best art ever. And again, it's not for everybody, but it doesn't cost anything. I guess if you purchase a coffee mug or T-shirt, but it shouldn't cost you anything, or shouldn't cost you much, to advocate for your particular child. Another thing that sometimes happens is, how do you get to observe the classroom? Now, Lou just got done with a tremendous effort on the camera bill, which will be in effect next year, or have the ability to be in effect next year upon request, but not every room is going to have a camera. So how do you get a flow of your campus? How do you get to observe your child? How do you get to know the teachers that work with your child? And one way to overcome that, and certainly you can go through the front door and say, hey, I want to sign in, I want to observe the classroom, but that is sometimes you only get a small portion. But if you become the Uber volunteer, you volunteer for the library, you volunteer for homeroom, you volunteer for the carnivals, you're volunteering for cleanup, you're volunteering as a crossing guard, you're volunteering as a cafeteria monitor, you're a volunteer to help raise funds for the teachers. If you're a volunteer, you have access everywhere. In fact, some of the most informed parents never really see the classroom. They're just volunteering every day, twice a week, 4 hours once a day, 4 hours once a week. Is that volunteering for that campus gives you an incredible access, and also as a volunteer, you're not seen as a threat. Because sometimes in an IEP or ARD process, it gets hot, it gets crossways. You have differences. This is your child. Things about your child are intense, and you're reigning power. And that's not a good one. Sometimes you just can't resolve it there. But if they see you in a different light outside the argument, you're the volunteer, you're the helpful mother helping other mothers, it really, really takes a wonderful, wonderful turn. Lou, I think we have some other things we want to move to, but those are some really easy ideas that parents can use free of charge as part of the toolbox.
That's a great breakdown of how it works, and it's extremely effective. Let's go in a slightly different direction, although this is sort of part of the toolbox, I suppose. Let's talk about using other statutes, such as the Americans with Disabilities Amendment Act.
Sure, absolutely. And this is something I've shared with my evil twin brother, Mr. Geigerman, where we sometimes are the special alchemists, and how do we use other laws such as ADA? Because if you really think about FATE, which the IDA is based on a 1982 Supreme Court decision named Raleigh, and all it says, if that child has an educational benefit, or that IEP is designed to have at least a minimum educational benefit, they've met their duty. And that's why sometimes it's really difficult to get those services to the level you need. But if you shift over to 504, in ADA, it's about equal access and equal opportunity. Equal access and equal opportunity. That's a much clearer standard, sometimes a little higher standard. And let me go back in history a little bit, too, because there's kind of an evolution I think is important as well. One of my favorite characters is Thurgood Marshall, Supreme Court Justice. But in his early days, he was a litigator, chief litigator for NAACP. And his very first case was against the University of Maryland. And at that time, it was separate but equal. It was still the law of the land. And the University of Maryland, remember, separate but equal. Separate but equal. And so when he sued the University of Maryland, he won because the University of Maryland didn't have a black law school. He didn't have a black law. So that really put him on the map. And they had this 20-year strategy on how to litigate to get to that point. So where in 1954, we had the Topeka versus Board of Education, which basically allowed kids of all colors to go to school. But if you think about that, why did Thurgood Marshall go to Topeka, Kansas? I mean, if you're going to desegregate in 1954, wouldn't you go to the South? Wouldn't you go to the North urban areas? Why do you go to Topeka, Kansas? Well, those good folks in Kansas, they really believed in separate but equal. So they funded the black school system and white school system equally. But when you crunch the stats, and when you think about data-driven, that's what IEPs are, that's what Thurgood Marshall did. He crunched the stats and showed that black and white kids going to school together did better than when they were segregated. Wow, how about that? Well, 20 years later, we're now into the civil rights movement. In the late 60s and early 70s, are now litigating whether kids with disabilities can have access to education with their non-disabled peers. And that's where 504 came. Parks versus Mills was a question of whether could somebody with an intellectual disability, formerly called mental retardation, could they attend school with their peers? And the answer was yes, even though it was revolutionary at the time. Again, equal access and equal opportunity. And that Parks versus Mills, that kind of gave us the language of 504. And 504 has been out there long before ADA. Even though we're celebrating the 25th year of ADA, 504 was out there 20 years before that, which said, thou shalt not discriminate. Equal access, equal opportunity. Fast forward, well, by the early 1990s, guess what? We have the American Disability Amendment Act, which really gets into it. You can't have physical barriers. You can't discriminate in employment. And Title II, which is very much like 504, says, thou shalt not discriminate. It's wonderful. Okay, well, a few more years, that was about 91, 92, because we are in the 25th anniversary of ADA, I think, this year. We had Olmstead. And Olmstead was a really interesting case. It was two women who were in a nursing home. They had disabilities and said, hey, we want to live in the community. And the state of Georgia said no. And John Zimmering, incredible attorney out of Atlanta, filed suit in 95, went to the Supreme Court in 99, and it said that individuals with disabilities have that ability to choose where they want to live. They don't have to be in an institution. And so one woman passed away, but the other woman got to live in an integrated community setting. Now think about that. Integrated community setting. Equal access and equal opportunity. That's what it's all about. Fast forward again, 2008, we have the American Disability Amendments Act. The American Disability Amendments Act, which basically expanded the category and really tried to remove some of the barriers on what's a disability. So the definition of a disability in 2015 is any impairment in a major life activity. Any impairment in a major life activity, because traditionally it was those disabilities that were observable. You were blind, you were deaf, you were missing a limb, you were in an iron lung, you had spastic quadriplegia, where you were moving all the time, you couldn't walk or talk. Well, now it's a impairment in major life activity, and in that, which was really fascinating, they added thinking, concentrating, focusing, and learning. Learning, that's a major life activity. Really, really incredible. So moving forward to where we are now, 2014, a year ago, there was a settlement agreement between the Department of Justice and the Department of Education in Rhode Island. Department of Justice and the Department of Education in Rhode Island. And what they applied was Olmstead, not just in the institutional sense, but to the community at large. So right now there's a 10-year consent decree, and it's revolutionary what they're doing in Rhode Island. And what they were looking at is workshops, because a lot of these shelter workshops, all they had was individuals with disabilities. Not a good pay scale. It was piecemeal, 75 cents an hour. They weren't having equal access and equal opportunity like everyone else. In fact, the term integrated community experience means that. It's an integrated community setting, an experience, equal access and equal opportunity. So when you read the settlement agreement in Department of Justice with the Department of Rhode Island of Education, it's incredible because they're on track, not just work, but where they're going to live. Where are they going to participate in their recreation and leisure time? We go to movies. We go bowling. We eat out. The same thing should apply. So it's really amazing how that is starting to occur. So if you're at your IEP meeting, coming back to where a parent can use that, besides the IEPs and BIPs and modifications and other things that you have there, one question to pose from an ADA 504 point of view is that plan, is the parameters of that document encouraging equal access and equal opportunity for that child to be in school. One other letter the Department of Justice had was one in Springfield, Massachusetts, because they had all the behavior problems, they had all the kids with severe disabilities all in these congregate settings. But they didn't have access to band or choir or extracurricular or any of the other things every other student got. So GOJ, in light of that equal access and equal opportunity to integrate the community activities, which include extracurriculars, band, choir, rallies, all those other things that every other student gets to do. So you can pose those questions at an IEP meeting or a 504 meeting, because the idea is that student, and again, it doesn't matter how severe the disability, it doesn't matter whether they are nonverbal or verbal, it doesn't matter if they're ambulatory, not ambulatory, or they're wheelchair reliant, is everything should be geared to make sure that child has equal access and equal opportunity within the structure of the school setting. Lou has a wonderful story. We started experimenting with this probably, it was right after the 2012 COPA convention, and we went out to an IEP meeting in a little bitty school district, I think called Walls, IC, just out of San Angelo, way, way out in West Texas. And Lou and I decided, Lou, you take the IDA version, and I'll take the 504 version. Lou tells it better than I do, so I'm going to let you tell the story.
Okay, so it's interesting. We both became aware of this particular client and said, let's go ahead and go to this meeting. So we went to it, and this child was he was in the spectrum, so he had some other issues going on. There had been some bullying allegations, and so we said, well, let's just go ahead. I'll do the special ed part of it, and David will look at doing the discrimination part, or 504. So it's interesting. There was a opposing counsel that was at this meeting that we both knew, and they didn't know that. They knew that I was coming, but they didn't know David showed up. He was showing up, and so I said, we gave greetings to the opposing counsel. I said, oh, by the way, there's a friend of mine here, and it's David, and it was kind of an interesting response to that, and so we proceeded in the meeting where I started talking about all the problems that the school had not addressed from a special ed perspective, and then David started talking about some of the discriminatory things that were barring access, and the meeting ended at that point and the opposing counsel had suggested, we need to mediate this. And we mediated it, and we ultimately came to a settlement on this. But it was because I think it really had a lot to do with that we were talking about accessibility in the 504 perspective as well as a special ed. So it kind of gave a little bit extra. I don't know. I want to say it was kind of bringing like a club. Figuratively, because the 504 discriminatory actions can really raise the level of concern to a district, because depending on what happens there, in extreme cases, there can even be issues of damages in very, very extreme cases. But certainly it would take a lot to litigate both sides of that, and because of that, that particular case came to an agreement because of it. So anytime that you can see a discrimination part of it, if a child is being discriminated or treated differently by other students, by being treated by the district differently than they would other students, there's a possibility of bringing 504 in on top of special ed. And I think having that as part of the issue, every time you look at a case, look at the possibility for discrimination, because that can be a very, very powerful tool. And again, even special ed, though, has an accessibility part of it. You've got to be, so there's a discrimination that's actually built into special ed, meaning accessibility. You have to have accessibility to be able to have an opportunity to access the services. So you got to look at it from all possible scenarios.
And kind of dovetailing in that, again, there is kind of an evolution of how things are being considered, because for a long time, everybody just kind of was under the impression that if you're IDA compliant, you're also 504 and ADA compliant, because the Art Committee considered those things until a few years ago, bless the Ninth Circuit out in California, where there was a Ninth Court decision says not necessarily. Is just because you're IDA compliant doesn't necessarily mean you're ADA or 504 compliant. And that comes back, again, to that equal opportunity and equal accessibility. And it's not, and there's two types of accessibility, just to break it down. There's architectural accessibility. Do they have a handicap ramp, handicap bathroom, water fountains? Can you get from point A to point B like everyone else? But there's also the programmatic aspect of accessibility. Are you being allowed to go to choir? Can you get to play on the playground? Can you go to the robotic club? Can you go to the chess club? Can you go to the rally? Can you go to the basketball game? If you wanted to cheer, can you cheer in a wheelchair? Of course you can. And so when you start looking at it, and because when you say discriminatory and 504 and ADA, that sometimes gets stilted. But using that terminology, again, it's equal accessibility and equal opportunity, because that's really what it's all about. And if you keep it in those terms, I mean, you can say IDA, 504, BIP, IEP, MOUSE, well, sometimes that becomes a stilted conversation because you're now relying on some format. But when you start talking about the child having the ability to have equal opportunity and equal accessibility, especially if it's coming from the child themselves, it really opens up a really wonderful opportunity. And it gets away from some of the kind of artificial structure, the software program that generates the IEP. It gets away from that format of an IEP meeting, because embedded in that, if you're asking that question, do they have equal opportunity, equal accessibility to the iPad, to the computer, to the announcements, everything that every other child typically has and or may be taken for granted? Because when you pose that question, it puts them on notice. Because if they don't have equal accessibility and equal opportunity to non-disabled peers, then it creates a much, much different discussion than whether the IEP is designed appropriately or not. Because an appropriately designed IEP does not always embed equal accessibility or equal opportunity. So we're not diminishing the role of the IEP. We're not diminishing the role of any of the services. But in using those services, that question, because that child, when they turn 18, 21, age out, they're going to be, we want them to be independent and employable and be able to function in an integrated community setting. That's the sum total of all the work that's gone in from Thurgood Marshall up to the conversation today, is making sure that children with disabilities or families who have individuals with disabilities, because not just children, it applies to everyone, is that they have that equal opportunity, equal accessibility. And that's part of the conversation today as well.
Okay, David, I want to speak on two more.
I think we're getting up to the top. We're getting close to the top of the hour.
We are.
I was going to save 5 minutes for a couple of just reflective comments
as well. That's great. I'd like to do this, and that would be great. I want just a real brief and then get into the reflective comments. I think that's perfect, okay? Very, very quickly, one thing that we didn't talk about was professional complaints. Can you go over that in like a minute?
Sure. If you go to a hospital, guess what? They have doctors and nurses. If they don't perform their duties appropriately, they have licensure boards. Nursing, board of nurses. Doctors, board of medical examiners in your state. Well, guess what? Everybody at a school has something that allows them to do what they want to do. The professionals, psychologists, OT, PT, speech, nurse, dietitian, they have professional licenses. So if they do something really, now remember when you start screwing with a person's job, because if they pull their license, they may be unemployed. They may not like that. So it's kind of a last resort, but it's one of the many tools that you have. So they either have a professional license, again, if they're professional board, psychologist, speech therapist, occupational therapist, physical therapist, nurse, or guess what? They have a teaching certificate. There will be a state board of education or something similarly situated in your state. And if they have a code of ethics, they have certain standards they're supposed to know. There are certain levels of knowledge and competency they're supposed to have. If they don't demonstrate that, such as implementing an IEP or providing an accommodation, certainly you want to be nice and try to share your concerns once or twice, and you may file a complaint. But sometimes you don't need to zap the whole school system. Sometimes the SPED complaint or the professional licensure complaint is like the sniper shot. There's just one individual, one person, the bottleneck your child's education that you either got to get their attention or they need to get out of your child's program, go somewhere else, go sell socks at Walmart or wherever you need to be, because there are some folks in education who shouldn't be there. Again, it's kind of a last resort. Now, it may cost some money, but the money is to send the complaint in by mail. So it's probably $5 or $6. Usually you have to send it registered. But what's a complaint? Same thing as everything else. Name and address of the individual you have a complaint about, what went wrong, and what do you want. And remember, when you're filing a complaint, think of it like a traffic ticket. Time, place, date, who, what, when, where. That's all you have to put down there.
Okay. Sounds good. So let's go ahead and do some reflective comments. I got about 3 minutes. And say what we'll kind of wrap up what your thoughts are here.
Sure. And this goes back, and Lou and I sometimes we deliberately reflect and consider how we can help others navigate the system. And so what you heard today is actually a condensation of many, many years.
David? I think I lost David here.
Can you hear me?
There. Now go ahead, David. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I have the metal plate in my head turned toward Houston. That should help. Okay. So the whole system is designed, and we just touched on a few of those things today. It should not be difficult for your child to get an education. If your child has a disability, it should not be difficult for that child to have an education. And the idea of the toolbox, it shouldn't be mysterious. It shouldn't be hard. It shouldn't be complex. Use these very simple things, because most everything has to start with your name and address, what went wrong, what do you want. It's just where are you going to send it? And you have lots of places to send it, local, state, or federal. So if you think of it the same way you deal with a bank or the same way you would deal with a business, you're there. Because for some reason, while we wouldn't take a bad burrito for more than 30 seconds at our favorite Mexican-American restaurant, or we wouldn't take bad milk from Walmart more than 30 seconds, or we wouldn't take a bank that lost our money, we would know what to do immediately. But for some reason, there's a fuzzy part of a parent's brain, and me and Lou are also parents of children with disabilities, so we have a fuzzy part of our brain too, as we treat schools differently. We'll let a bad educational program go on for weeks and weeks, months and months, and sometimes even years. And we won't respond in the same way we would if we got a bad burrito. So the idea here is using that same intelligent consumer business approach every parent has. Because if you have a child with a disability, you've been checking out the pediatrician, you've been checking out services, you've been checking out the different types of assistive technology, or if you're wheelchair reliant, you're looking at a customized wheelchair. Parents who have children with disabilities are really smart because they have to go above and beyond to really look at how their child's going to navigate the day. So you have really intelligent parents, but sometimes as parents, I'm talking being Lou's parents now, we don't look at it as a business. We respond differently to a school. We'll take a bad IEP or bad education for 6 months, where every other part of our life, whether it's a doctor, restaurant, sauna, spa, we wouldn't take it more than 30 seconds. So the idea here is treat them as a business. Have those same business expectations. Have those same dynamics you would put into any other business you're dealing with, because they're getting your money. Well, guess what? The school's getting a lot more money than you would at Walmart. So to summarize, use that business sense and some of the ideas we had today. Use your procedural safeguards. Use informality. Use your community. Use those around you. Ask a lot of questions, but advocate as strongly and as vigorously and as robustly you would for any other business that didn't serve you well. Or if the business is serving you well, you compliment them. Same is true of schools. Don't forget, again, the Starbucks, the donuts. Donuts are wonderful. They last for 3 days. In fact, most donuts now will outlive the lifespan of the container they came in. so they go for a long time. So, but the idea is use those skills you have in every other part of your life. Don't forget to use it in the school setting.
David, I'm going to end it on that point. David, I think this has been a great conversation and very, very useful to parents as they go through the beginning of their school year. David, I'm going to have you back on other shows from time to time, and I want to thank you for coming on the Special Ed Section 504 Radio Hour. It's great information. Remember, David's a Special Ed Marine, and he's, great guy, good friend, and thanks for being on the show, bud.
And if you need to contact me, again, I don't charge for emails. If you have a question, just email me, specialedmarine@yahoo.com, just like it sounds. Not to try to insult the Marine Corps, but that's who I am. I'm a Special Ed Marine, specialedmarine@yahoo.com.